You know, we could all use some encouragement. And I've got some good news for you. Welcome to 5 Minutes with Mark. Welcome, friends. Welcome back to 5 Minutes with Mark. We're going through our casual stroll through the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to pick up chapter 11, verse 1. Now, when they drew near Jerusalem to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples, and he said to them, "Go into the village opposite you, and as soon as you have entered it, you will find a colt tied, on which no one has sat. Loose it and bring it. And if anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' say, 'The Lord has need of it,' and immediately he will send it here." So they went their way and found the colt tied by the door outside on the street, and they loosed it. But some of those who stood there said to them, "What are you doing, loosing the colt?" And they spoke to them just as Jesus had commanded, so they let them go. We'll stop right there. This is a really interesting little passage. And there's a lot here that we probably would normally miss. The first thing that's really interesting is that Jesus is on his approach into Jerusalem. And he comes to Bethany and Bethphage. These are 2 villages that are on the arid side, on the eastern side of Mount Olivet, or the Mount of Olives, which sits just east of Jerusalem. In fact, the Mount of Olives is actually higher than the Temple Mount. So it was a place where the Jews would go after the destruction of Jerusalem and look down and see where the temple used to be and mourn. It's been used as a grave site for the Jews for thousands of years. There are about 150,000 graves dug into the Mount of Olives. And there's a lot of history that takes place here. David fled from Absalom, if you remember that story, and he went to the Mount of Olives. Jesus actually gives his Olivet discourse. He's going to give his end times discussion here on the Mount of Olives. We'll get to that soon. Also, it's at the base of the Mount of Olives is where the Garden of Gethsemane is. So they're going to go out after the Last Supper singing hymns and heading to Mount Olivet, to the garden. And we know that Jesus is going to ascend from the top of Mount Olivet into heaven in Acts chapter 1. So a lot of significance with the Mount of Olives, historically for the Jews, and certainly in the New Testament. Another really interesting thing is they mention of Bethany. Bethany, if you recall, is the place where Lazarus and Martha and Mary live. It's this village, just like I said, on the eastern side of the Mount of Olives. So we get to Bethany, go over the mountain, down, and then into Jerusalem. And that's what's going to happen shortly. So Jesus gets there, and Luke doesn't really give us the Bethany story. We know from the Gospel of John, chapter 11, that Lazarus is dead, and Jesus goes and he brings Lazarus out of the grave. He has a connection with Martha and Mary and Lazarus in Bethany, and he spends a lot of time there. And in fact, he's going to go into Jerusalem and then return to Bethany. That's his operating camp, really, for this area. So he gets to the Mount of Olives, and he sends 2 of his disciples into one of the villages opposite. It doesn't really say whether it's Bethphage or Bethany. I would assume it's Bethany, but that's just my assumption. And he says, "Go and find a colt of a donkey, a young male donkey on whom no one has ever ridden. You're going to find it tied up at a house. Go loose it and bring it here. And if anyone says, 'What are you doing?' just say, 'The Lord has need of it,' and they'll let you have it." I think that's a really interesting thing, that Jesus shows his divine ability to know, right? This cognizance that he has. It wasn't that he made it happen. He just knew He just knew the colt was there. God is omnipotent and omnipresent. He knows all things at all times. And Jesus, even in his human restricted form, if you will, taps into that divine knowledge and knows that this colt is there. And it's necessary, and we'll talk about that next time. It's a necessary thing for this colt to be there. I find it really interesting in the other Gospels. We don't see so much, especially in Matthew. If you read the same story in Matthew, Matthew jumps in and tells us about the prophecy that is being fulfilled here. Luke tells us what these guys are supposed to do if they get some pushback from the locals. What happens if we get there and people ask, what are you doing? And Jesus says, just tell them the Lord has need of it. And what happens? They get into the village. They find the colt, just like Jesus says. They begin untying it. And this people who are standing around go, hey, what are you doing? It's a very human moment, isn't it? It's exactly what would happen. And that's one of the reasons that I think the Gospels are so important for us to study. And I especially love the Gospel of Mark because it gives us this very human Jesus. This is a very human moment where Jesus he's in need. He knows, and he gives the guys the words to say before, he already knows there's going to be some pushback. Isn't it comforting to know that no matter what situation we find ourselves in, God knows? Isn't it comforting to know that even when we're sent to do things that the world thinks are wrong or out of place or, out of bounds even, the Lord knows, and he will give us the wisdom that we need to navigate those troubles when they rise. Isn't it comforting to know that as this history unfolds in the Gospels, it continues to this day. And the history that began at this point, at the base of the Mount of Olives, is going to be fulfilled when Jesus returns to the Mount of Olives. This is the place where the Messiah is coming back to. Just as he left from the top of the Mount of Olives, he will return to the Mount of Olives, according to the book of Zechariah. That's where he touches down. So, very, very important piece of the story begins with Jesus knowing what's going to unfold. And he already knows not just where the donkey is, he knows where this path is going to go. And even knowing that, he's turned his face toward Jerusalem and will not be turned away. Aren't you glad that he did not turn away? Hey, hope you enjoyed this one. We'll see you next time. Till then, God bless. I hope you're enjoying this Bible study, this quick devotion. If you'd like more content, you'd like to know more about me and see more of the things that I'm doing, check out my website, theeclecticmonk.com. There you'll find out about my video vlog, my podcast, and a whole lot of other stuff. Hope you'll join me there. Thanks.